The forest was thick with shadows, and the scent of pine and damp earth lingered in the cool air. A vast, untamed wilderness lay before Ava, a conservationist sent to monitor the wildlife in this remote sanctuary. She had been here for days, alone, surrounded by towering trees, the occasional distant cry of a bird, and the rustle of leaves under the feet of unseen animals. The hum of nature felt like a living presence, vibrating through the air, uninviting and yet alive with purpose. Ava had been coming to this part of the sanctuary for years, studying the delicate ecosystems, watching as the wildlife roamed free. There was a strange beauty to it, the way the forest seemed to pulse with life, even though she could never quite see it all. But this time, something felt different. A low unease had settled in her chest ever since she arrived, a feeling she couldn't shake, as if the forest itself was watching her, aware of her presence. Her dog, Luna, a sleek black shepherd mix, trotted ahead, her movements graceful and sure. Luna had been her companion on these trips for years, her watchful eyes always alert, guiding them both through the wilderness. But today, something about Luna's demeanor was off. The dog was hesitant, her ears flicking at the slightest sound, her body tense as she kept close to Ava's side. Ava noticed it immediately, her brow furrowing. Luna, usually fearless and confident, was now skittish. Ava tried to brush off her concern, telling herself it was simply the unfamiliarity of the dense forest, but deep down, she knew it was more than that. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, stretching shadows across the ground, Ava and Luna ventured deeper into the forest. The air felt heavier now, the stillness almost suffocating. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves, a bird calling in the distance, and the soft padding of Luna's paws on the earth. But there was something else beneath those sounds, something subtle, a quiet shift in the atmosphere. Luna's behavior grew more erratic. The dog started to pull away, as if she could sense something Ava couldn't. She would pause suddenly, staring into the distance, her body rigid, before continuing forward, only to stop again moments later. Ava's pulse quickened as the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees pressing tighter, the shadows darker. She could almost hear the forest breathing. The unease that had been gnawing at her all day escalated. Ava stopped walking, watching Luna with growing concern. The dog was now whimpering softly, her eyes fixed on something just beyond the edge of their path. Ava followed Luna's gaze, but saw nothing, only the thick underbrush, the shadows cast by the trees. Yet something was there. She could feel it. A low growl rumbled from Luna's chest, and the dog took a step back, pulling at the leash. Ava tugged gently, but Luna resisted. Ava's grip tightened on the leash, her heart pounding. Something was wrong, very wrong. The growl grew louder, and suddenly, the silence was broken by a sharp crack, a twig snapping in the distance. Luna's head whipped toward the sound, her eyes wide, her hackles raised. Ava's pulse raced. Another snap, this time closer. The hairs on her own neck stood up. She was no longer alone in the forest. Luna barked sharply, the sound echoing through the trees, and for a moment, everything went still. Ava froze, her breath caught in her throat. She glanced around, her eyes darting nervously through the trees. There was nothing visible, no shape in the shadows, no movement to indicate what Luna had sensed. But she knew something was out there. Luna's growls grew more insistent, louder, as if the dog was trying to warn her. Ava's mind raced. Should they leave? Should she turn back to the safety of the camp? But the forest, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a maze of unseen dangers. Another snap, this time much closer, right behind her. Ava's eyes widened. She spun around, but the forest remained still. The silence was deafening, and yet the tension in the air was palpable. Luna was frantic now, barking and pulling at the leash, her body trembling. Ava could hear her own heart pounding in her ears. She crouched down beside the dog, trying to calm her, but Luna wouldn't stop. Something was out there, and it was getting closer. Ava slowly stood, her hand gripping the strap of her backpack, her other hand on the leash. She began walking briskly, trying to keep pace with Luna's nervous energy. The forest felt darker, as if the trees themselves were closing in on her, the path narrowing with each step. Then, the ground beneath her shifted. Ava's foot slipped, sending her tumbling forward, and for a moment, the world went dark. She hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. Luna's frantic barking filled her ears, and Ava scrambled to regain her breath. When she pushed herself to her knees, she saw the source of her fall. A hole. A small, almost hidden pit in the ground, overgrown with vines and leaves. Her heart raced, her breath shallow as she stared down into the hole. There was something inside it. She reached into her pocket for her flashlight and switched it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, and what it illuminated made her stomach twist. A body. Not an animal, but something far worse, a human body, long dead and decomposed. The remnants of clothing, torn and weathered, clung to the skeletal remains. Ava's hand trembled as she clutched the flashlight, the beam shaking as she stared at the face that was barely recognizable. It was the face of someone she knew. Someone who had been a part of the wildlife sanctuary, a researcher who had gone missing several months ago. Her pulse thudded in her ears. The missing person, the signs of strange behavior in the forest, the way Luna had reacted, it was all starting to make sense. But the realization was too much. Ava stood frozen, the blood draining from her face, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and disbelief. Then, a noise. A rustle from the trees. Luna, still barking furiously, backed away, her eyes wide in terror. Ava's heart skipped a beat. She didn't dare turn around, but she could feel that something was approaching. The sound was coming closer. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. A soft crack of twigs underfoot. The air grew heavier, the shadows deeper. Ava's hand instinctively tightened on the leash, but Luna was already pulling her in the opposite direction, urging her to move, to run. Without thinking, Ava turned and sprinted, following Luna through the dense underbrush. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her mind racing with the terrifying thought of who or what might be following them. The forest seemed alive now, the trees shifting and whispering in the wind. Ava's legs burned, and Luna's frantic barking echoed in the distance. As the light from her flashlight flickered and died, a deeper darkness settled in around her. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sounds stopped. Ava slowed her pace, her chest heaving as she glanced around. The forest had returned to its eerie silence, but something had changed. The air was thick, heavy with a sense of presence, and her skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. Luna's body was tense beside her, her eyes scanning the darkness. Ava's mind raced. She had found something that was meant to stay hidden. But as she stood in the growing silence, she realized that the forest was not just a place of natural beauty. It was a place of secrets, of things that had been buried long ago. And now, something was hunting her. The forest had always been alive with the sound of animals, the hum of life. But now, it was alive with something else, something far darker. Ava's mind raced as she stood there, heart hammering in her chest, her senses heightened by the overwhelming silence that enveloped her. She wasn't alone, that much was clear. But what Torhu was out there, lurking just beyond the veil of shadows? Luna's body quivered at her side, her ears pressed flat against her head. The dog, who had always been so brave, was now trembling, her eyes wide with terror as she stared into the dark forest. Ava tried to calm her, but even she could feel the tension in the air, the oppressive weight of an unseen presence pressing in from all sides. Every branch that creaked, every leaf that rustled, seemed amplified now, as if the very forest was alive and breathing with a quiet malevolence. Ava swallowed hard, feeling the cold sweat trickle down the back of her neck. She had to move. She couldn't stay here. Not with the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. A flicker of movement to her right caught her eye. Ava's breath hitched, and her pulse quickened as she spun in that direction, her hand instinctively gripping the flashlight that had now gone dim, its feeble beam barely cutting through the thick darkness. Nothing. Just the trees, standing still and silent. The shadows seemed to deepen, stretching longer as the night grew colder. Luna, however, was no longer looking at the trees. The dog was staring at the ground, her body coiled, ready to spring. Ava followed Luna's gaze and froze. There, beneath a cluster of thick roots, partially concealed by leaves, was something new. A footprint. Fresh. The soil around it was disturbed, as if something or someone had been there moments ago. The imprint was too large and too deep to be an animal's, and there was something unnatural about it, something that made Ava's blood run cold. She knelt down, trying to steady her breath, her hand reaching out to trace the edges of the print. It was human, but the depth and the way the earth had been disturbed made it look as though the foot had been forced into the ground. Almost as if whatever had made the print had been in a hurry or struggling to keep its balance. Ava's stomach twisted. The missing researcher, the one she had been trying to find for weeks. What if they were still alive, somewhere in the forest, trapped by whatever had been lurking in the shadows? But if that was the case, why hadn't they made a sound? Why hadn't they called out for help? A low growl vibrated from Luna's throat, breaking Ava's thoughts. The dog's eyes were wide, her body tense, her ears pinned back against her skull. Ava stood quickly, her gaze darting around the dark forest, searching for the source of the growl. But there was nothing. Only the dense underbrush and the towering trees. And then, another noise. A faint, almost imperceptible rustling. It was behind her. Before Ava could react, Luna bolted, her leash yanked from Ava's hand as she shot toward the sound. Ava stumbled backward, her heart leaping into her throat. The dog's bark echoed through the trees, frantic and wild. "Come back, Luna," Ava cried, her voice tight with fear. But the dog didn't return. Ava's breath quickened, her hands trembling as she started after Luna, pushing through the thick underbrush, her flashlight flickering once more. The beam of light caught fleeting glimpses of the forest, but it did little to calm her racing thoughts. Luna's barking had stopped, replaced now by a distant, eerie silence. She pushed harder through the underbrush, the ground slippery beneath her boots. Her heart was a pounding drum in her chest, her eyes darting to every movement in the shadows. It felt as though the forest itself was closing in on her, each step pulling her deeper into the unknown. The flashlight finally died completely, leaving Ava in a pitch-black void. The only sound now was her breath-fast, shallow and the pounding of her heart. She paused for a moment, trying to collect herself, listening for any sign of Luna. Nothing. Ava's mind was spinning. She had to find Luna. She had to get out of this place. She fumbled in her backpack, desperately searching for another flashlight or any source of light. Her hands shook as she dug through the bag. And then she felt it, a small glow stick. She pulled it out, cracked it, and watched as it emitted a faint, greenish light. She took a deep breath and began moving again, the faint glow casting long shadows before her. Every step felt heavy, like she was wading through molasses. The forest around her seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees twisting and turning in unnatural ways. There was no path anymore, just the chaotic wilderness closing in on all sides. And then, another sound. A whisper of movement in the distance. Ava stopped, holding her breath, her body tensing. She turned slowly, eyes scanning the darkness. There it was again, a faint rustling, like something moving through the brush, not far off. This time, she couldn't ignore it. She followed the sound, her feet light on the ground, her breath shallow. Her heart was pounding louder now, nearly deafening in her ears, but she pressed on. The rustling grew louder, closer. And then, in the dim glow of the stick, Ava saw something that made her stop dead in her tracks. Luna. The dog was standing in the middle of a small clearing, her body rigid, her eyes wide, her tail straight out behind her. But she wasn't alone. A figure stood in the shadows behind the dog, barely visible in the dark. A tall figure, thin, draped in tattered clothes that blended into the forest. The figure was bent at an unnatural angle, its face hidden in the shadows. But Ava could feel its eyes on her, dark, empty eyes that seemed to pierce through the very core of her being. For a moment, everything stopped. Ava's blood turned to ice in her veins. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. But the air was thick with the sense that something had gone horribly wrong. The silence stretched on, suffocating, before the figure took a step forward. And then, Luna growled, low and guttural, her fur standing on end. Ava's throat went dry as the figure stepped into the light, revealing its face horribly familiar. The missing researcher. Their skin was stretched tight over their bones, their eyes hollow and vacant, as if life had long since fled their body. But it wasn't the same person. No, it was something else entirely. Something that had survived far beyond its time. Something twisted and unnatural, living in the shadows of the forest. Ava's body went cold, her mind screaming at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. And then, with a sudden jerking motion, the figure lunged toward her. The forest was alive with whispers as Ava's world shattered.